No matter what your background, if you work as an entrepreneur, you're going to have to work in an agile environment. Now, you might have heard about agile methods before, but I want to talk to you about what I think about when I think about an agile working method. So let's go back to when I was opening my first business. I had this brilliant idea to take sheet music that musicians would use and digitize it and create a sort of custom piece of hardware that would allow them to flip between the pages. And this was before tablets were even around. And so when I thought about the product that I was going to create, I thought about it in linear terms. I thought about it as a starting point and an ending point. I begin the process of creating it, manufacturing it, distributing it, and the end point was getting it into the hands of the customers. But this is a very old-fashioned way of thinking about innovation and entrepreneurship. Innovation and entrepreneurship should never be a linear process. We have to think of it in a way that's non-linear. And all that means is that we have to approach the design and development process as a cycle. And it's a cycle that repeats itself over and over and over again. Now, there are an infinite number of ways that you can use an agile methodology when you're designing and developing a new product or service. But one of my favorite approaches is to think of it in 3 parts: build, measure, learn. And like I said, it's a cycle, so you're going to build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, until you have something that's ready to roll out to the market. So let's start with the build process. Building just means creating. So what are you going to develop? What ideas are you going to create? What products or services are you going to come up with? It's about putting something into some kind of tangible form, even if it's just a short presentation, even if it's a prototype, even if it's the simplest version of your idea. But getting something ready, getting something prepared so you can move into the next stage, which is measure. So now you're going to take what you've done, you're going to take whatever it is you've created in that tangible form, and you're going to evaluate it to understand how it's working, whether or not it's doing what it's intended, and whether or not your idea actually has value. Now, when you're measuring, a great way of doing this is to approach the communities and stakeholders that might have an interest in what you've created. And this gives you a chance to validate what you've done and make sure that the stakeholders and the users or the customers actually want what it is that you've created. A good way of failing as an entrepreneur is to create something within your own narrow framework of understanding and never talk to another person about it. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues had a PhD student, and the PhD student came to his supervisor and he said, "I have a great idea for my PhD. What I'm going to do is innovate a new operating system that is customized for people who are blind or partially sighted." Now, my supervisor took one look at him and said, "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" He insisted this is the best idea he's ever had, and it's going to be a great and revolutionary thing. And so the supervisor came back to him and said, "Hey, why don't you talk to some people who are blind or partially sighted and just see what they want?" So of course he approached the disabled people's organization and he asked them, "What do you think of my idea?" And they immediately dismissed it because they didn't want a customized operating system just for them. They wanted an operating system that works for everyone. They want to use the same operating systems that everyone else uses, but they want it to work for them. So he quickly had to completely reformat his idea and go a different direction. This is why the measure component of build, measure, learn of an agile methodology is so important, because it gives you a chance to understand more critically what it is you've done. Measuring is not enough. Evaluating is not enough. You have to actually synthesize that evaluation. You have to understand that evaluation a little bit better and be able to learn from that evaluation. So the learn process is actually taking that new knowledge and applying it to what steps you want to take next. It's really easy to get stuck with the information you get in the assessment and think, "Oh, I have to do this, and this." When in reality, if you take a step back and you think about it, you might realize that actually this function or feature that was recommended in the assessment isn't something I want to include in my final product or service. And so it gives you a chance to take that step back and try to understand a little bit better about where you want to go next. And of course, after you finish that learning process, you'll move back into a building process. You'll create something that goes one step forward. And you'll continue to run through this cycle over and over and over again until you get what's called a minimum viable product. And what that means is you have something that you could potentially sell or put onto the market or make available for people to use. Now, the other really key criteria for an agile methodology is that this is a cycle that doesn't extend over weeks and months and years. An agile methodology should happen at a very rapid pace. So going through that cycle one time should take at most maybe 2 weeks. Sometimes it's even less than that. And you could even run through that cycle in a matter of a couple of days, especially at an early stage of development. What I usually recommend to my students is to manage the design and development process in 2-week sprints. And in each of those 2-week sprints, you can likely run through that cycle at least once. And in your planning, you should plan 2 to 4 weeks out. So that's really only 2 sprints that you can plan for. After 4 weeks, it's important to have milestones, it's important to have goals in mind, but it's no use planning concrete tasks outside of 4 weeks. And that's just because it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen next when you're developing a new product or service. You may decide to pivot your company in an entirely different direction. You may realize that the product or service you intended to create is going to experience a regulatory barrier that would make it impossible or at least delay your rollout for several months or years. And so in an agile development process, it's really important to stay agile. And that means you shouldn't lock in concrete plans that go beyond 4 weeks, and you should be revisiting your timeline on a regular basis. Especially in an early stage of development, you may want to revisit your timeline every day or every couple of days. And just make sure that your goals are still feasible and make sure that the tasks that you're actively engaged in make sense for what you want to do next. And don't be impatient. The important thing about working in an agile environment is that you're open to new opportunities as they emerge. So don't get discouraged if things start to go into a different direction. You haven't wasted time. All you've done is go further along the pathway. If you push yourself to continue down a pathway that's no longer going to serve the interests of the business, then that's a waste of time. Make sure you stay flexible and adapt whenever new opportunities come. Now, if you're working as an innovator or entrepreneur, you're likely to be working in a team. And one of the questions I'm often asked is, how often should we meet? And so as part of that 2-week sprint, I usually recommend that teams meet almost every day. It doesn't have to be a long meeting. Hour-long meetings are rarely ever needed. If you're going to have a meeting that lasts longer than an hour, then you might as well make it a workshop or something where people are prepared to come in and actively engage in the development process. Otherwise, set meetings that are 5, 10, or 15 minutes long. Just long enough so you can check in with each other and see how things are going. And in each of these meetings, I usually have a standing agenda that goes like this. First, we go around the room and everybody says what they've been working on. Second, we go back around the room and everybody says what they're going to work on next. And third, we talk about any risks or potential barriers that we may face in going those next steps. Now, this gets you operationally working very, very well. But there's another dimension to the agile process that people rarely talk about. And that is how we can communicate as a team and support one another. Being an entrepreneur is a very intense and can be a very high pressure experience. So having mutual and peer support, knowing that you can count on your teammates and knowing that you can be honest with yourself and with them about your own limitations is really, really important. And I'm going to cover that on a new video about non-violent communication.